both recommended the same person, Paul Richards, who has very distinguished and impeccable anthropological credentials. He is the Emeritus Professor of Technical and Agrarian Development at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He previously worked in the Department of Anthropology at University College London. And he lives now in the Netherlands and does a lot of work in West Africa, particularly Sierra Leone. And he worked at the International African Institute from about 1975, which was not long after Barbara Pym retired. So, but unfortunately, he never met her, but certainly they had a lot of acquaintances in common. And he's very kindly agreed to talk to us this afternoon from the Netherlands. So please welcome Paul Richards.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Barbara Pym loved Germany, so I suppose it's appropriate that we've had the academic quarter hour before we start the talk. So I was asked to talk about Barbara Pym as a novelist among anthropologists, and that's where I'll land my talk with a discussion of her last novel and try to explain to you why I think that it was a very interesting and profound reflection on her life working in the International African Institute. So let me tell you a bit about the International African Institute to begin with. Barbara Pym began to work for the International Institute of African Languages and Cultures on the 28th of February 1946. So it was her first sort of proper civilian job. And the Institute had been founded about 20 years earlier by educators and missionaries, but with support from prominent retired colonial administrators. And the aim was to develop educational materials. And the Institute coordinated and published research on African languages and cultures to that end. And the name was often shortened to the International African Institute, or IAI. The IAI undertook both anthropological and linguistic studies. The orthography, system of writing of African languages, of which there are many, was a particular concern. Children make better progress in all subjects if taught in their mother tongue, and this required reading materials in those languages. So standards had to be established for the printing of such books for Africa. The IAI also administered at that time an award to encourage creative writing in African languages. And this is the first mention in her novels of the Institute. Pym makes fun of this linguistic aspect in her first published novel, Some Tame Gazelle. A bishop delivers a lantern lecture to some rural English churchgoers, and his audience is baffled by a recitation of the International African Phonetic Alphabet, followed by his rendering of some African songs. I think I know where these songs came from. She probably encountered them in an article by the German musicologist Erich von Hornbostel, which was reprinted from the first issue of Africa, price 1 shilling and sixpence, and addressing the question, how can African music be used in church and school? And when I was in the Institute, I found a dusty box in a corner with off-prints of this article. And clearly that Barbara Pym had actually had access to this, and she read it and mentioned it in the novel. But her main work was with the quarterly learned journal Africa, which was a major outlet for anthropological research on the continent. And it was the Institute's flagship. So for 28 years, from 1945, its editor was Cyril Daryll Forde, who is a picture of him there. Forde continued to edit and to direct the IAI even after retiring from his chair at University College London in 1971. Hiding the pain of his final sickness, he worked a routine office day and died at home on the evening of the 3rd of May 1973. Within a year, Barbara Pym stepped into retirement. The IAI had been the sum of her post-war working life and a constant background to her novelistic career. Pym highly respected her boss's intellect, but thought he lacked manners. What Daryll Forde thought of her own manners is unrecorded, but his high regard for his editorial secretary, as she was then termed, is evident in the fact that her name eventually appeared under his own on the distinctive dust red cover of each issue of Africa, where she's named now as the assistant editor. That's slide 3, Jamie, if you've got the button handy. Anyone there? Okay, well, you'll see the dust red cover of Africa with her name on it in a moment. Probably Jamie's got better things to do with his time fixing the system. Oh, there it is. In addition to her work preparing the quarterly issue of Africa, Barbara Pym had practical responsibility for all other publication activities at the IAI. This included overseeing the publication of book-length volumes of the African Ethnographic Survey, a major documentary project started by Forde, and editorial management of a series of specialist monographs in African studies, published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the IAI. In the same year as he became director of the IAI, 1945, Forde had taken charge as professor of a new department of anthropology at University College London. He now had work enough for 2 people. Since he could not be in 2 places at once, Barbara Pym had considerable freedom to plan her own work at the Institute. When Forde retired from UCL in 1971, Pym remarks that he then came into the Institute 5 days a week, making for a more hectic office environment in his last 2 years. It was in this period that Pym began to work on her last novel, Quartet in Autumn, a book, as I will suggest, strongly influenced by Forde's life and death. The pattern of her working life was shaped by the needs of the journal. Every issue of Africa had to have a quota of full-length articles, generally 4 per issue, copy-edited and proofread by Pym, in addition to book reviews, shorter notes, news items, and occasional letters. Any time left over went on the editorial management of the Ethnographic Survey and the monograph series. There was also an international executive board to be managed and at times entertained. The stress associated with the ceaseless editorial work occasionally spills over in her letters to her friends, the poet Philip Larkin and Robert Smith, a British historian based in Nigeria. Larkin was a university librarian and Smith was an academic historian of the Yoruba people of Western Nigeria, so both readily understood and sympathized with the pressures of her work. It's sometimes commented that Daryll Forde's encyclopedic anthropological knowledge, second to none in British academia at the time, came in part from editing Africa for over 25 years. Barbara Pym worked with him on the journal throughout and must have gained a similarly comprehensive level of knowledge, if perhaps at a finer level of detail acquired through daily clarifying murky prose and checking obscure facts. She uses this knowledge to convincing effect in her creative writing, but perhaps nowhere more so than in her comic portrayal in Less Than Angels of the costive Alaric Lydgate, an anthropologist who produced sardonic reviews but never proper articles. His field notes and African artifacts were eventually reduced to ashes in a garden bonfire, which I like to think may have been Pym's own preferred resolution to some of her work-induced worries and frustrations. She comments in correspondence about having back-to-back articles of exceptional dullness, lack of content for the notes and news section, and laggard book reviewers. The names of the worst offenders were entered into her never-to-be-invited-again notebook. A couple of slides will serve to illustrate some of the challenges she faced. In R.E. Bradbury's contribution to the African Ethnographic Survey volume on the Benin Kingdom, Western Africa, part 13, 8 pages from page 160 have been bound in upside down. And that's the next slide, so you can enjoy seeing one page the right way up and the other page the upside down. This must have generated panic in the office and a lot of anxious phoning around to decide what to do. Pulp the lot, probably. I was given my copy of this monograph by Barbara Pym's successor, Nicola Harris, presumably from the box of unsaleable items Pym never got round to throwing out. A second slide reveals some of the complexities of illustration demanded by less than straightforward anthropological book publication. Government in Zazou, a book of 1960 by Michael Smith, M.G. Smith as he was always known, That must have posed many problems, since it had a number of complicated fold-out maps and an end pocket with 9 or so family trees showing the descent of a number of important rulers in pre-colonial Zaire. So that's a picture of Smith, and that's just a tiny snapshot of a thing that folds out for several folders. I mean, it goes on forever, and how you ever fold them back and keep them in the book and so on must have been a nightmare to physically produce. Editing this material and ensuring Oxford University Press had assembled it all correctly in the shipped copies will have been the stuff of nightmares. Pym took the challenges of her editorial work very seriously, and she even attended some of Forde's lectures to be better prepared to edit work on anthropological theory. The Smith volume may have particularly stuck in her mind, since she makes it the focus of an incident in the novel An Unsuitable Attachment, in which a hapless young library assistant is ticked off for not knowing that while most OUP volumes are published in Oxford, those published for the IAI had to be entered into the bibliographical catalogues with London as the place of publication. Possibly the doubtless many times cursed pull-out genealogies in the back pocket of government in Zazou also lurked in her mind when she struck out the word descent and replaced it with descent in copy editing a paper on pre-colonial politics in northern Nigeria by a young British historian of Africa, Murray Last, who's a good friend of mine. He told me the story, but it also appears in one of her novels. The paper was about political conflict, not succession. This resulted in an urgent visit by a distraught author, proof in hand, to demand reinstatement of his original title. And that appears, I've forgotten which of the novels, but anyhow, it was interesting that Murray told me the story almost exactly as Barbara Pym writes it in the novel. It's obviously a story against herself, which she quite enjoyed. Her meticulous work on the hugely complicated and much unread government in Zazou was unrequited love. There's no acknowledgement to Barbara Pym in the preface. Maybe she thought Smith, a protege of Forde, also lacked good manners. But she fares better with The Lele of the Kasai, a book of 1963, a similar in-depth work by another rising star in Forde's UCL department, Mary Douglas. I knew Douglas quite well in her later life and rather regret never having asked her about Pym. It might have been a fascinating conversation, linking two of the sharpest minds ever to have analysed the microscopic mores of middle-class English domestic life. It seems to me somewhat surprising that Pym makes little or no mention of Douglas in her letters documenting her IAI years. They will have interacted extensively over several papers that appeared in Africa prior to the book and over the book itself. They both shared an Oxford background and a forensic eye for domestic detail. Perhaps Mary Douglas's seminal essay, Deciphering a Meal, appeared too late to have been the subject of asides during telephone editorial consultations. Douglas began to take her work to other publishing houses in the 1960s, so that's maybe why they never actually linked up or linked up in her diaries and biography. But surely Pym would have agreed with Douglas's conclusion on English middle-class dinners that the rules of the menu are not in themselves more or less trivial than the rules of verse to which a poet submits. Anyhow, whatever the case, Douglas indubitably had good manners and properly acknowledges Pym in the first edition of The Lele of Kasai, where she says, "I also owe thanks to Miss Barbara Pym for her help in seeing the manuscript through the press." A year later, Pym elicited an even more fulsome acknowledgement for her editorial work. In his introduction to Yakur Studies, a book of 1964, her boss, Daryll Forde, writes, "I'm grateful to Miss Barbara Pym, editorial secretary of the Institute, for her very great help in collating and checking the text of this volume." Pym commented in a letter to her friend Robert Smith, "Daryll's book on the Yakur is in second proof stage, and of course, I have to give it much attention, being so fulsomely thanked in the foreword." Pym documents her relationship with significant men in her life in considerable detail, both in her diaries and later in letters. Forde is different. He was a major presence for over 25 years, but the letters are circumspect. For a sense of what she thought of him, we need to turn to the novels, where a number of characters reference his persona. Even at that, we're often shadow boxing around absences, Arguably, it's Forde's death that creates momentum in the plot of what some consider her greatest novel. I would judge it also to be her most anthropological. Quartet in Autumn is no longer about anthropologists, it's about anthropology itself, and specifically the kind of anthropology with which Forde's name is particularly associated. It was her tribute, I suggest, to what her boss had taught her. Let me say a bit about Daryll Forde now. Daryll Forde was a Londoner with a local authority grammar school education. One imagines that this might be what Pym meant by his lack of manners compared to those of her many privately educated friends from Oxford. Forde studied geography and archaeology at UCL, coming under the influence of Grafton Elliott Smith, a pioneer in the studies of the evolution of the human brain. After completing a PhD with Elliott Smith, Forde was granted the opportunity of a Commonwealth scholarship for a 2-year stay in Berkeley, California. This exposed him to the ideas of Robert Lowy and Albert Kroeber, students of the influential German-American anthropologist Franz Boas. Boas helped reorient anthropology from evolutionary and at times racialized explanatory frameworks to a focus on comparative cultural studies. Forde switched to the Boasian path. This shift in her boss's intellectual development is retraced in her novel An Unsuitable Attachment, when the anthropologist Rupert Stonebird wearily explains that he is a lecturer in social anthropology, concerned with the behavior of men in society rather than with the size and shape of their skulls. Forde then returned to UK to become the youngest ever head of the Department of Geography and Anthropology at the University of Aberystwyth. For a time, he continued with archaeological excavations while adding some cultural enquiries in a Welsh village. This was then followed by a decisive first step into African anthropology when a Leverhulme grant allowed him a 6-month period of fieldwork in 1935 among the Gakur people of the Cross River in southeastern Nigeria. A further research period in 1939 was cut short by the start of the Second World War. Forde's relative lack of time in the field was the subject of some gossip among his colleagues, even though perceptive commentators noted that he'd done more with his limited opportunities than many anthropologists did with greater field time at their disposal. A reason for this was that he was better prepared, commanding an armory of archaeological, geographical, and anthropological skills. Forde then became involved in war work in Nigeria. West African colonies had a strategic role as the Desert War in North Africa expanded. The condition of local subsistence economies and the capacity of these countries to feed themselves became a vital strategic concern. Forde was recruited to an Oxford-based project to examine the native economies of Nigeria, publishing the results in an important book with Richenda Scott. With the return of peace, Forde was appointed to lead a new department of anthropology at UCL, along the broadly Boasian lines it still retains today, and to direct the International African Institute at a time when decolonization was creating a demand in UK for better knowledge of the language and cultures of Africa. Fresh from her own war work, Barbara Pym was one of Forde's first and most crucial appointments, since the IAI would have to carry out its essential publication activities under a part-time director also preoccupied with setting up a new field of academic research and education in UCL. At the Institute, Forde and Pym formed a formidably effective team and quickly created an impressive body of new scholarly literature on Africa, with at times extremely limited resources. In running both the Institute and a major academic department, Forde shouldered huge administrative burdens. His obituarists also note his generosity with his time in advising on the work of others and the enthusiasm he showed for the advancement of anthropological knowledge as a whole. His breadth of interest and generosity of spirit, as Pym's novels often suggest, was far from common in his discipline. But there was one thing lacking from Forde: a major monograph in his research field. Many sciences build knowledge brick by brick from a never-ending stream of papers in top journals. Anthropology, at least in Forde's era, was different. A substantial period of fieldwork led to a book-length synthesis on which one's academic reputation then rested, supplemented by papers resulting from subsequent combings of leftover field notes. We met two examples already in the monographs by Forde's junior colleagues Mike Smith and Mary Douglas. Pym understood Forde's predicament to be the equivalent of, to quote from An Unsuitable Attachment, a housewife faced with the remains of yesterday's stew, wondering whether it can possibly be eked out to make another meal. One of her characters, Everard Bone, then makes an explicit comparison with anthropologists, eking out a single short field trip in articles and even books for the rest of their lives. Forde's 2 short periods of fieldwork in Nigeria had been interrupted by the war, and afterwards he was too busy to return. A full ethnographic study of the Yakur was a book that remained to be written, and time was slipping by. Some of Forde's colleagues, the student M.G. Smith among them, urged him to plug this gap in his publication list by binding together previously published papers that he'd written on Yakur ethnography. It wouldn't be the big book itself, but it could stand in its place. Barbara Pym played a major part in this process of, to quote, eking out another meal, working on the available ingredients to produce a passable approximation to the feast required. The papers had to be cleaned and filleted to remove passages of repetitive background. The work could only be done by an editor with excellent knowledge of the kind of dish it was supposed to resemble. The final product was critically well received. There's a slide there, I think, of the most III books had plain covers, as you've seen, but this one, they pushed the boat out and had a full, well, not a full colour, but they had a colourful, interesting cover page. And the final product was well received, and Forde now has had his monument, confirming his status as a leading anthropologist. And perhaps only Barbara Pym could have rustled up such a convincing collation with the restricted resources at hand. As already noted, a grateful Forde acknowledged her editorial craft in his introduction. I'll say a bit about Yakur studies because it's relevant to where I land at the conclusion to this paper in talking a bit about her last book, Quartet in Autumn. Forde's death in 1973 hastened Barbara Pym's retirement in 1974 and gave her the opportunity to complete her last novel, Quartet in Autumn. The novel, I suggest, dwells on themes raised in Yakur studies. To make my argument, I need to provide a brief introduction to Forde's book and apologise in advance for some of the anthropological detail before turning to look at Pym's last novel in more detail. Yakur Studies is based on 9 previously published papers by Forde on a 30,000-strong group of people of the Cross River Basin, the Yakur. The Cambridge anthropologist Maya Fortes, who wrote Forde's obituary for the British Academy, described Forde's ethnography of the Yakur as bringing to notice a type of African polity that had previously hardly been known about. The reason for that is that African rural societies were often organized into clans based on descent from a common ancestor. And normally this ancestral reckoning takes place along either the male or the female line, through the father or through the mother's brother. Anthropologists call these 2 ways of reckoning descent matrilineal and patrilineal. They were generally seen as rival schemes. So to have both, as the Yakur did, was unusual. In the anthropological jargon that Pym loved to mock, the Yakur were a group held together by double unilineal descent. What that meant in practice was that Yakur patrilineal clans could be seen on the ground. They were the people you lived with. The members tended to live together, but the matrilineal clans were harder to detect, except by family insiders who knew who their relatives were. Forde brought to light these hidden inner connections. M.G. Smith rightly recognised the quality of the fieldwork involved, short though it was, as reflecting Forde's prior training as a geographer and an archaeologist, allowing him to map out and statistically interpret organisational complexity, not apparent at first sight. A more basic question then arises. Why would the Yakur go to the trouble of keeping such a huge mass of complicated social information in their heads? The answer was that they used different means of reckoning descent for different purposes. Access to land and farm labour was organised via the patrilineal clans. It was your father's people to whom you turned when you needed help in cultivating yams. And that made practical sense because they lived locally. But property, livestock and money, passed through the mother's line, and like the mother at marriage, livestock and money tended to move around. As a result, Yakur persons never quite knew when and where they might be lucky enough to inherit a share in some money or some livestock. The prospect of a windfall legacy was in effect a reminder to stay in touch with your mother's family, scattered as they were across the wider Yakur landscape. And all this doubtless remained vivid in Barbara Pym's mind from her detailed work on piecing together Forde's missing big book. I've not been able to discover whether Forde knew Pym was a published novelist or what he thought of this side of his editorial secretary's life. The revival of her fortunes as a novelist postdates Forde's death. I do know, however, that her published novels were physically present in the Institute offices at 210 High Holborn, shelved along with other IAI publications, which were retained when the rest of the library was sent to Manchester University for lack of space. But I doubt they were much read at all until 1977, when at last she became famous. A passage in An Unsuitable Attachment, a novel written in the Forde era but not published until later, seems to suggest the kind of self-justification she might have offered had her boss ever asked her about her life beyond the office. She quotes from that novel, "Haven't the novelist and anthropologist more in common than some people think? After all, both study life in communities, though the novelist need not be so accurate or bother with statistics and kinship tables." Daryll Forde was rare among social anthropologists of his generation or later in making systematic use of statistics. The words about the closeness of the novel to ethnography are placed in the mouth of a character, Everard Bone, who is a senior anthropologist. Were these the sentiments that she hoped Forde might have endorsed? The possibility certainly arises that her last novel may have been consciously conceived to demonstrate the closeness of the links between anthropologists and the novelist. So now I'll end with a brief discussion of Quartet in Autumn. Pym appears to have begun Quartet in Autumn in 1972, but the work was probably largely a product of her retirement. In it, she sets out to give Everard Bone's words some substance. She knew the secret of the eked-out stew that went into the cooking up of Yakur studies, but she also knew the book's argument about matrilineal and windfall inheritance she knew that argument more thoroughly than most. The plot of Quartet in Autumn centers around the property that Marcia unexpectedly leaves to Norman. The idea of an unexpected inheritance through women, shared by both books, is unlikely to have been a coincidence. It's also far from being the only point of contact between the novel and Forde's ethnography. Forde's book makes considerable play of the role of age and cult among the Yakur, and these two elements duly play a major part in Quartet in Autumn. Age, of course, is a central aspect of the novel. Pym called it her book about old people, specifically a group of office workers who face retirement together, but without the overt age group status enjoyed by Yakur elders. There will be no further public recognition in retirement that they were once a team. The members of the office quartet will have to turn to other organizational resources to rebuild their lives. As in many Pym novels, cult also plays a significant part, generally, in her case, the cult of high Anglicanism. But in Quartet in Autumn, the novelist takes trouble to make clear that only one of the four, Edwin, is attracted by such ceremony. Like Edwin, the Yakur shopped around for cult experience. A plurality of cults was an important aspect of their religion, but not a significant unifying factor. Likewise, in Quartet in Autumn, cult plays no unifying role. Cult in Quartet in Autumn is a means to exorcise ghosts or calm the restless spirits of the departed, resorted to only by those such as Edwin, especially troubled by such things. So significantly, it's only Edwin who takes up the invitation to attend the memorial service for the late director of their institute, evidently a Forde-like eminence. He sees himself as going on behalf of the group and then discovers something decidedly strange. A memorial service devised by an institution its detractors used to call the Godless Polytechnic of Gower Street. University College London was founded in 1825 to provide university education for nonconformists, atheists, Jews, and women. The board rejected any denominational identification within the college confines. Memorial services for late professors were sometimes held in the Church of Christ the King, physically adjacent to the back of the college. This was rented by the university chaplaincy, but belonged to a defunct millenarian sect. In the view of the college, it was a convenient rather than a sacred space. And in any case, many UCL professors were atheists. Edwin cannot find his bearings in what seems to him a contradiction, a church service for non-believers. Barbara Pym actually attended a memorial service for Forde at Christ the King, remarking in a letter to Philip Larkin of 11th July 1973 that DF was not a believer, so it wasn't very Christian, consisting of readings and music with an address by a colleague. She then promptly adapts the experience to the needs of her new novel. When I first read the episode in Quartet in Autumn, I was struck by the skill and precision with which she captured the peculiar ambience of this distinctive rite. Forde's memorial took place before I joined the anthropology department at UCL in 1979, but I participated in quite a few similar subsequent memorials. This was because I belonged to a reasonably competent college-based string quartet, and we were sometimes invited to play the music that interspersed the readings and address at such events. Our small repertoire of solemn pieces was carefully chosen to avoid striking any religious note of reference. Alas, anything from the wonderful sequence of quartet pieces by Joseph Haydn on the 7 last words of Christ was out of the question. Edwin's dilemma of whether to take a second glass of sherry in the reception afterwards for fear of falling asleep at his desk in the afternoon was also repeatedly our own dilemma. In Pym's novel, the memorial service gently concludes Forde's place in her story. Thereafter, one of the quartet, Marcia, dies, and the fate of the remaining members becomes the focus of attention. A feature of Forde's book on the Yakur now comes to the fore, namely the idea that tracing social connection through a woman is as significant as tracing it through a man, because each system of reckoning does different things in terms of facilitating further social relations among the living. The office hierarchy in which the quartet had worked had been male-dominated, with a Forde-like figure as patriarch. But Norman's security and retirement results from unexpectedly inheriting his colleague Marcia's house in her will. This notion of inheritance facilitated by the agency of a woman now drives the plot of Quartet in Autumn, as surely as the entailment on Mr. Bennet's property requiring his daughters to marry well drives the plot of Pride and Prejudice. Quartet in Autumn also speaks to another anthropological concept that Pym will have acquired from her close working association with Forde, that of so-called fictive kinship. A working life often builds strong social associations. Old soldiers can treat former comrades as members of the family. The story of Quartet in Autumn unfolds around another such working group bonded by fictive kinship sustained into retirement. Pym never married, but maintained strong relationships with former flames and is keen to explore in her final novel the implications of such relationships. Friendship, as well as kinship and affinity, she seems to suggest, has its own enduring social structure. What Pym had in mind is perhaps reflected in her choice of title. Quartet might simply indicate a foursome, the 4 main characters of the story, related through their shared work as support staff in the Institute. But she was musically quite well informed, and the novels embrace a broad framework of musical reference, stretching from A Whiter Shade of Pale to Mahler's symphonies, even of the Yoruba folk opera The Palm Wine Drinker, a performance of which was arranged by the historian Michael Crowder for the entertainment of the executive committee of the Institute, was not to her taste. It's plausible then she might have had a string quartet in mind as her model of fictive social cohesion. A string quartet is a musical formation dependent on internal direction and self-effacement by its individual members. It owes nothing to a conductor. A star soloist would wreck the proceedings. There is a slide here of, I've chosen to picture the TALLINN string quartet because I doubt even the most musical members of the audience will know the names of any of the players within it. They're a very fine quartet, nevertheless. Barbara Pym spent the larger part of her working life as an essential member of such a self-effacing team in the service of a higher academic goal. A focus of her novel is the channeling of the sense of disciplined teamwork to the social challenges of retirement. This is a new theme in literature, and she tackles it with a self-confidence that reflects her grasp of African anthropology. The group of retirees in Quartet in Autumn has to find another basis for association than the common task the members shared for many years. The proposed answer is to take fictive kinship seriously. The bonds forged by cooperation and friendship are too valuable to be squandered on retirement. They need to find another outlet. The task becomes finding ways of invested shared meanings in Norman's windfall inheritance. Pym applies Yakur rules to the space Forde has vacated. The intergenerational transfers must be handled properly. Without attention to the details, the social world cannot flourish again after death has done its destabilizing work. Post-mortem distribution can at times take on the character of an unseemly fight, but at others, it's a collective endeavor to relocate items in a way the deceased would have recognized and approved. It is in appreciating the social values of the deceased, not who gets what, that inheritance reinforces cohesion among the living. The episode with the milk bottles and the redistribution of tin supplies are thus both richly comic, but also deeply touching, in a way that they bring the hitherto hidden domestic concerns of the departed team member to the notice of the others, who then search for the most fitting way of reordering a domestic microcosm overturned by death. To some, this sorting out of the affairs of the departed might seem trivial, but it is not a joke. Pym's skill is to bring out the deeper meaning of trivial. Anthropologists might term it quotidian ritual. By this, they mean that life takes on a larger meaning through its minor gestures. Without a grasp of these small inflections, the larger ceremonial occasions make no sense. We see this at work in bereavement. The living gain new strength from aligning themselves with the overlooked minor concerns of the dead. No longer making fun of absurd anthropologists, the burning of Alaric Lydgate's field notes, for example, but now applying what she's learned from Forde, notably about the devolution of assets at death to her own social world. Pym derives in Quartet in Autumn a lesson that we're all bonded by friendship, and that friendship is nurtured by careful observance of the smallest details of our interactions. What could be more anthropological than that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I think that although we did have a bit of a delay, we've got a bit of leeway. I think we've got time for a couple of questions before our next speaker starts. That's not mine. So who would like to ask a question? Yvonne, of course. Now, Yvonne, I don't know if you've actually met Yvonne, Paul, but she actually worked at the International African Institute. But she left before Barbara did. So Yvonne, would you like to?
Well, I would just like to know what happened to, well, the library in particular. I was an assistant to Ruth Jones from in the early 60s. Well, after I left, I didn't take much more interest. But later on, I wondered what actually happened to, well, to the library, which was really quite substantial.
Did you hear that, Paul?
Yes, I got the question, and I think I know the answer. I think it was all moved to Manchester University, is my memory.
Yes,
I would have to check to be absolutely sure, but I remember that there were discussions about keeping the library, but the rent problem, the IAI had always wanted a central London office because it was in part a political agency. It advised governments and so forth. And central London rents are obviously extraordinarily expensive. So the library simply occupied too much floor space, basically, and they didn't want it broken up. So I remember that there were discussions about what should happen to it. And I think, if my memory serves me, that it was the period when there was a problem over the editorship of Africa after Forde died. Pym herself refers to it in her letters, I think, that they were setting up a kind of joint arrangement. So there was a kind of shared directorship and a shared editorial responsibility for Africa. And she says, somewhat to the point, I wonder how that's going to work out. Well, it didn't work out terribly well. So then there were a number of temporary arrangements, and there was a connection through the anthropologist Paul Baxter, who was at Manchester, and I think that somehow that was what happened to the library. But I'll check with the current staff of the Institute and see whether anyone actually knows the answer. But my memory is that it was wherever it went lock, stock, and barrel, and it was, the idea was to keep it together as a teaching and research collection. So whichever the lucky university was, then I'll check. But my memory tells me it went to Manchester.
Thank you.
But after that, I once heard from somebody, goodness knows, my memory is totally gone now, but that the books went out to a library in Africa, in Basuto land, or whatever that's called now.
That I don't know.
That doesn't mean anything to you?
I know the Institute has had various attempts at dealing with the shortage of academic literature in Africa, because libraries simply can't afford to or couldn't afford to buy books in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Things are getting better now because a lot of scientific literature is electronic, and it's much easier to provide and cheaper in the end to provide an electronic link to an African library. But there were several attempts to send spare books that academics had and so on, or bits of libraries that were being dispensed with, and then to see whether they could be found a home that would welcome them in Africa. So it might be the case, I don't know, but I'll ask Stephanie Kitchen, who is the editorial manager of the Institute, whether she knows, and I can get back, I can let Deb know what actually happened subsequently to the library.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Any further questions? I think you know that people are overwhelmed by the your sheer academic brilliance and the complexity of the subject that is anthropology. Yvonne actually has not completely changed from being a librarian in an anthropological institute, because she's now the archivist of the Barbara Pym Society.
Ah.
So you know, we are a sort of anthropological hodgepodge of people, really. Right, if there are no more questions, thank you very much, Paul, and perhaps you'll stay with us. Oh, sorry, somebody has thought of something, and it is our next speaker, as it happens.
Yes, Barbara sort of fell into her job with the International African Institution, I understand. Typically today, what sort of person would be doing the job that Barbara did? What sort of background would they have?
Well, I mean, the current incumbent of the post, the editorial manager of the International African Institute in charge of the journal Africa and the monograph series, is Dr. Stephanie Kitchen. And I think that's kind of interesting, because she's a trained academic Africanist and relies very heavily on her academic skills to do the editorial work. And what was remarkable about Barbara Pym was that without any training, she managed to do that job, and she did it by training herself. I mean, she actually attended Daryll Forde's lectures both at the LSE and at UCL to kind of become familiar with what anthropology was trying to do and who the anthropologists were. And I think that sort of self-training on the job is really quite remarkable, because today the job could not be done unless you were a fully trained PhD level. Stephanie Kitchen, I think, is a historian, but you'd have to be fully trained to PhD level to handle the demands of the job. So it says a lot for what Barbara Pym did, and the high regard in which she was held, not alone by Daryll Forde, but by many academics who were extremely grateful for her sharpness in alerting them to difficulties with what they'd written and facts that might need to be checked and so on and so forth. She was very present in the editorial process, and you can see initially Forde is calling her an editorial secretary, but then later she appears on the front page of Africa as the assistant editor of Africa. And by the end, in fact, she was actually, I would say, writing the books, but in the case of Forde's monograph, she was very instrumental in pulling it together into something that constituted an acceptable Africanist monograph. So it's a remarkable story of someone who worked themselves into the job and created the job, which others now continue at, shall we say, a more academically, formally trained level.
Great.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think that I recall from, I think it was a letter or a diary entry. She said something like, being assistant editor of Africa surely should be enough when the editor is off lecturing in Harvard for 6 months. So I think that that's a very sort of Pymish way of putting it, that she sort of, clearly felt that she was doing a really important job, but that subtle feeling, it wasn't quite what she wanted, maybe, but...
Well, I sort of wonder whether she had a love-hate relationship with it. It wasn't the job she would have applied for, but at the end, she turned it into the job that she wanted. It was pretty much all her skills apart from the purely creative. And in some cases, I'm sure she rewrote whole paragraphs of gibberish and turned them into something that would be readable in the journal. And there were 4 issues a year. So 4 papers times 4, so 16 full academic articles, and all the paraphernalia that went in, the notes and queries and the book reviews and the book reviewers who never gave their reviews in on time and all the rest of it. This is a really challenging editorial job, and it showed a much higher level of skill than is contained in a phrase like editorial assistant or anything. She really helped make the International African Institute into what it was in Daryll Forde's directorship. And he knew that, and he was grateful. And I think that was a very sincere comment that he put in acknowledgement. It wasn't just a kind of casual, oh, thanks to my colleagues who've helped me in this. That was a really significant acknowledgement. And she recognizes that in her own correspondence, that she was kind of called forth to produce her best at that moment, because she had been given that responsibility to shape a major academic monograph.
Wonderful. Thank you. Is that okay, Lucia? I think, Paul, we'd really hope that one day you'll be here with us in person. So
yeah, I'd love to be.
So that we can mine your anthropological knowledge to full extent. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.